I was 23 years old when I dug my first foxhole in the frozen ground outside Bastogne, December 19th, 1944. My hands were already numb, and I hadn't even seen a German yet. Private First Class Danny Morrison, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. They called us the Screaming Eagles, but right then, the only thing screaming was the wind cutting through my field jacket like it wasn't even there. I'd jumped into Normandy 6 months earlier on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of France, survived Market Garden in Holland when half my platoon didn't, and I thought I'd seen the worst of it. I thought I knew what war looked like, what it smelled like, what it cost. I was wrong about all of it. What happened in those woods around Bastogne, in that frozen hell they'd later call the Battle of the Bulge, that changed everything I thought I knew about war, about myself, about what human beings can endure when there's no choice left but to endure or die. We'd been in Mourmelon-le-Grand, France, supposedly resting and refitting after the disaster of Market Garden. Rest is a funny word for what we were actually doing. Most guys were drinking themselves stupid on cheap French wine and cognac, trying to forget the sound of German 88s tearing through the air, trying not to think about the friends we'd left behind in Dutch fields and streets. The 101st had taken brutal casualties in Holland. Whole squads wiped out, companies reduced to platoon strength. We'd been promised a month to rest, to get replacements trained up, to repair our equipment and our spirits. We got 3 weeks. On the night of December 17th, 1944, everything went to absolute shit. Word came down from division that the Germans had launched a massive offensive in the Ardennes forest, a surprise attack along a supposedly quiet sector of the front. Panzer divisions, SS units, the works. They'd punched through the American lines in multiple places, and the whole front was collapsing. Every available unit was being rushed forward to plug the gaps before the Germans could break through completely and maybe even reach the coast. We were loading onto trucks within 2 hours of getting the order. The truck ride from Mourmelon to Bastogne was one of the most miserable experiences of my life. And that's saying something considering what came after. We packed into open-topped deuce-and-a-half trucks, 40 guys per truck, standing room only. No canvas covers because there wasn't time to rig them. It was snowing hard, big wet flakes that soaked through your uniform and then turned to ice. The temperature was maybe 20 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping fast. We were still wearing the same field jackets and wool trousers we'd worn in France during the fall. Nobody had issued us winter gear yet. The supply situation was completely fucked from the start. Half the guys didn't even have their full combat loads of ammunition. I had maybe 3 bandoliers for my M1 Garand, 72 rounds total, 2 fragmentation grenades, and a half-eaten chocolate bar I'd been saving since before we left Holland. That was supposed to sustain me through what turned out to be a week-long siege against the best the German army could throw at us. The convoy moved north through the night, headlights off to avoid German aircraft, crawling along icy roads that were clogged with American units retreating in the opposite direction. That should have been our first clue how bad things really were. You'd see tanks rolling south with their turrets turned backward, crews looking shell-shocked and defeated, infantry units moving in groups of 10 or 20 men, no organization, no officers, just guys trying to get away from whatever horror they'd just experienced. They'd shout warnings as our trucks passed. "You're going the wrong way. The Germans are everywhere. Panzers and SS. Turn around while you can." But we kept going north toward the sound of artillery that was getting louder with every mile. Sergeant First Class Mike Kowalski, my squad leader since basic training at Tokowa, walked alongside the trucks for most of the journey, making sure nobody fell asleep and froze to death. Kowalski was a Pennsylvania coal miner before the war, tough as nails, built like a brick shithouse and mean as a snake when he needed to be. He'd already earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, and he had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you could walk through fire if he told you to. He kept shouting the same thing over and over. "Stay awake, keep moving, we're the 101st, we don't retreat." Easy to say when you're walking and keeping your blood flowing, harder when you're standing in the back of an open truck with ice forming in your eyebrows, and your feet going numb in boots that weren't designed for winter combat. We rolled into Bastogne just before dawn on December 19th. The town was already in chaos. American units from the 28th Infantry Division, 9th and 10th Armored Divisions, artillery battalions, headquarters units, everyone who'd been caught in the initial German assault was streaming through Bastogne, trying to escape the encirclement. The roads were clogged with vehicles, Sherman tanks sitting abandoned because they'd run out of fuel, half-tracks with blown engines, trucks loaded with wounded men groaning and crying for medics who weren't there. The whole thing looked like the end of the world. Our trucks pushed through the mess to the town square, where Colonel Robert Sink, our regimental commander, had set up a hasty command post in what used to be a hotel. Officers were running around with maps and radios, trying to figure out what the hell was happening and where to position our units. The intelligence picture was basically non-existent. Nobody knew exactly where the Germans were, how many of them there were, or when they'd hit us. All we knew for sure was that we were surrounded or about to be, and our job was to hold Bastogne until relief could arrive. How long would that take? Nobody knew. Days, maybe a week, maybe longer. Did we have enough supplies to hold out that long? Absolutely not. But those were our orders, so that's what we were going to do. My company, Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 502nd PIR, got assigned to defend the northwestern approaches to Bastogne, right along the main road from Houffalize. That road was critical. If the Germans could push down that road with their armor, they'd roll right into Bastogne and the whole defense would collapse. So our job was simple. Hold that road. Hold it against tanks, against infantry, against artillery, against whatever the Wehrmacht wanted to throw at us. We moved out to our positions in the pre-dawn darkness, humping through knee-deep snow, carrying everything we owned on our backs. My load was probably 80 pounds. M1 Garand, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tool, shelter half, extra socks that were already soaking wet, canteen, first aid kit, gas mask that I'd probably never use but had to carry anyway because regulations. We reached our assigned sector just as the sun was coming up, or trying to. The sky was grey and heavy with snow. The landscape was all forest and frozen fields, rolling terrain that gave the Germans plenty of cover to approach. Lieutenant James Macready, our platoon leader, pointed to a spot on the edge of a tree line and said, "Dig in here. 2-man fighting positions, 6 feet apart, stagger them so we have interlocking fields of fire. I want positions deep enough that you can stand up without exposing yourselves. Get to work." And then he moved off to position the other squads. Digging a foxhole in frozen ground is one of the special torments of war that nobody tells you about beforehand. The top 6 inches of soil was frozen solid, hard as concrete. You couldn't get a shovel through it. You had to use your entrenching tool like a pickaxe, swinging it down with both hands, chipping away tiny chunks of frozen earth one at a time. It took me and my foxhole buddy, a kid from Iowa named Gerald Patterson, about 4 hours to dig a hole that was maybe 3 feet deep and barely wide enough for both of us to crouch in. By the time we finished, my hands were raw and bleeding despite my gloves. My shoulders were screaming, and I was soaked with sweat that immediately started freezing against my skin. Patterson was in even worse shape. He was 19 years old, fresh replacement who joined us after Market Garden, and this was his first time on the line since jump school. He was so scared he could barely hold his entrenching tool. His hands shook constantly, his teeth chattered even when he wasn't cold, and he kept asking me the same questions over and over. When do you think they'll attack? How many do you think there are? Do you think relief will come soon? I gave him the same answers every time. Soon, a lot. I hope so. What else could I say? I didn't know any more than he did, and lying to make him feel better seemed pointless when we were both probably going to die in the next few days anyway. Once we had our positions dug, we started improving them. Laid pine branches across the top for overhead cover against artillery, piled logs and rocks around the edges to stop rifle rounds and shrapnel, cleared fields of fire so we could see Germans approaching from at least 100 yards out, marked ranges using trees and terrain features, so we'd know exactly how far away a target was when we started shooting. All the things they'd taught us in training, all the things we'd learned the hard way in Normandy and Holland. By noon on the 19th, we had a respectable defensive line. 3 platoons dug in along about 400 yards of tree line, with machine gun positions anchoring each end and mortar teams positioned behind us to provide indirect fire support. On paper, it looked good. In reality, we were maybe 120 men trying to defend a sector that should have been held by a full battalion of 500 or 600. But that's all we had, so that's what we worked with. Kowalski came around to each position, checking our work, making sure we had clear fields of fire and decent cover. When he got to my hole, he looked it over, nodded once and said, "Good enough. You'll die comfortably here." That was Kowalski's idea of a joke. Nobody laughed. The Germans probed our lines late that afternoon. Not a major attack, just reconnaissance by fire. We heard them before we saw them, voices in German echoing through the trees, the crunch of boots on snow, the metallic clink of equipment. Then movement in the woods maybe 150 yards out, grey shapes moving between the trees. Patterson saw them first, grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, pointed with a shaking hand. I counted maybe a dozen Germans moving in a loose skirmish line, rifles at the ready, sweeping through the forest toward our positions. They didn't know exactly where we were yet. They were searching, probing, looking for weak points in our defenses. Lieutenant Macready had been very specific about his orders. "Do not fire until I give the command. Let them get close. Make every shot count." We watched them come closer. 100 yards, 75, 50. I could see their faces now, young guys like us, scared and cold, just doing their jobs. Macready let them get to within 40 yards, close enough that we could hear them talking to each other, and then he blew his whistle. Every rifle in the platoon opened up simultaneously. The Germans never had a chance. They were caught in the open with no cover, and we cut them down in maybe 10 seconds of sustained fire. I fired 8 rounds from my M1, heard the distinctive ping as the clip ejected, reloaded, fired 8 more at targets that were already down. When the shooting stopped, there were bodies scattered across the snow in front of our positions. Maybe half the German patrol lay dead or wounded. The rest had retreated back into the woods. Patterson was shaking so hard I thought he'd drop his rifle. He'd fired maybe 3 shots, and I think he'd hit one of the Germans because the man had gone down hard and wasn't moving. Patterson leaned over the edge of the foxhole and vomited into the snow. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? He'd just killed his first man, maybe his first person ever, and he'd have to live with that forever. Welcome to war. That became the pattern for the next few days. The Germans would probe our lines, testing for weaknesses, and we'd drive them back. They were feeling us out, trying to figure out how strong we were, where our positions were, what kind of firepower we had. By December 20th, the situation had deteriorated significantly. German forces had completely encircled Bastogne. Every road leading into town was cut. We were surrounded, isolated, cut off from any support or resupply. The weather had turned even worse. Heavy snow fell constantly, thick clouds that grounded all aircraft and made air resupply impossible. The temperature dropped below 0 at night, maybe 10 or 15 degrees during the day if we were lucky. We were still wearing summer-weight field jackets and wool trousers. Nobody had winter coats, nobody had insulated boots, nobody had the proper cold weather gear we desperately needed. Guys started getting frostbite in their extremities. Toes, fingers, ears, noses. I saw men with fingers turned black from frostbite, swollen and dead, but they kept fighting because what else were they going to do? You couldn't evacuate the wounded because there was nowhere to evacuate them to. The aid stations in town were overflowing with casualties from the initial German attacks. Men were lying in the streets, in cellars, in churches, anywhere there was shelter, waiting for medical attention that might never come. The ammunition situation became critical faster than anyone expected. We'd arrived in Bastogne with maybe a basic combat load each, 120 rounds for the M1 rifles, 30 rounds for the Thompson submachine guns, maybe 200 rounds for the Browning automatic rifles. By December 21st, we were down to half that. Every man in the company was rationing ammunition like it was water in the desert. You fired only when you had a clear target, no suppressive fire, no shooting at suspicious movement in the trees, no wasting rounds. Every bullet had to count because we didn't know when or if we'd get resupplied. The same applied to grenades. We'd started with maybe 2 or 3 per man. By the 3rd day, most guys were down to 1 grenade, saving it for absolute emergencies. Tank attacks, close assaults, last resort situations only. Kowalski started teaching us how to make improvised explosives, using captured German gasoline and empty wine bottles we'd scavenged from abandoned houses in town. Molotov cocktails. That's when I really understood how desperate our situation was. When your sergeant is teaching you to make firebombs from gasoline and glass because you don't have proper anti-tank weapons, You know the army doesn't expect you to get resupplied anytime soon. Food ran out completely around December 22nd. The mess units tried to get hot meals out to us for the first few days, but it became impossible once the Germans started shelling the supply routes. We ate whatever we had in our packs and whatever we could scavenge from abandoned positions. K-rations mostly, those wax paper packages with crackers and cheese spread that tasted like cardboard soaked in motor oil. Maybe some ham or egg powder if you were lucky. A few pieces of hard candy that would break your teeth if you tried to bite them when they were frozen solid. I made one K-ration last an entire day. Breakfast was 2 crackers, lunch was half the cheese spread, dinner was the other half of the cheese and whatever else was in the packet. You learn to eat slowly, to make it last, to trick your stomach into thinking it was getting more than it actually was. Drinking water was another problem. The streams and ponds were frozen solid. We melted snow in our helmets, held them over small fires until we had maybe a cup of water, drank it fast before it froze again. But you had to be careful. Drink too much melted snow and you'd get dysentery, and there was no medicine for that, no way to treat it. I saw men shit themselves in their foxholes because they couldn't leave their positions long enough to move to a latrine. They'd just crouch in their hole and let it happen, and then they'd sit there in their own waste for hours or days because there was nowhere else to go. That's the part of war nobody talks about, the degradation, the loss of basic human dignity, the way combat reduces you to an animal living in a hole in the ground, eating scraps, drinking melted snow, defecating where you sleep, waiting to kill or be killed. The German attacks intensified on December 22nd and 23rd, not just probing attacks anymore, but full company-sized assaults supported by armor. We could hear the panzers before we saw them, that deep, throaty engine sound, completely different from American Sherman tanks, and the distinctive squeak of their tracks on frozen ground. The first time a German tank came toward our position, I nearly panicked and ran, just stood up and bolted toward Bastogne, but Kowalski grabbed me by my webbing and physically threw me back into my foxhole. He had a bazooka, one of those M1A1 rocket launchers that weighed about 15 pounds loaded and kicked like an angry mule when you fired it. He made me act as his loader while he aimed. My job was to pull the safety pin, tap him on the helmet when the rocket was armed, and then get down before the backblast cooked me. The tank was maybe 150 yards out, grinding through the snow directly toward our positions. I could see the long barrel of its main gun traversing back and forth, searching for targets. Kowalski aimed carefully, took his time despite the tank getting closer every second. Fired. The rocket streaked out with a whoosh and a trail of white smoke, hit the tank right on the front glacis plate. Nothing happened. The rocket just bounced off, exploded harmlessly in the air behind the tank. The armor was too thick. The crew spotted our position from the rocket's smoke trail. The tank's hull machine gun opened up, MG-34 firing at maybe 800 rounds per minute, bullets tearing through the trees above our heads, clipping branches and sending splinters flying. We pressed ourselves into the bottom of the foxhole, helmets pulled down, praying. Kowalski reloaded the bazooka with shaking hands, aimed again. This time he went for the tracks, fired. The rocket hit the tank's left track and detonated, blowing apart the drive sprocket and several track links. The tank slewed sideways, immobilized, the crew unable to move but still able to shoot. The turret traversed toward us. I saw the main gun elevate slightly, knew what was coming next. Kowalski and I scrambled out of our foxhole and ran maybe 30 yards to the left, dove behind a fallen log just as the tank fired. The shell hit directly where our foxhole had been, obliterated it, threw up frozen earth and snow in a massive geyser. If we'd stayed there, we'd be dead. The tank crew bailed out through the top hatches, ran back toward German lines. We let them go. We didn't have ammunition to waste on running men. Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1944, was the lowest point of the siege for me personally. We'd been surrounded for 5 days, no resupply, no reinforcements, no relief. We were down to maybe 20 rounds per man, 1 grenade if you were lucky, and no food at all. Guys were literally starving. I'd lost maybe 15 pounds since we arrived in Bastogne. My uniform hung off me like a tent. My face was gaunt, eyes sunken, skin grey. I looked like a corpse that hadn't had the decency to lie down yet. Patterson had stopped talking entirely. He just sat in our foxhole staring at nothing, his lips moving silently. I think he was praying. A lot of guys were. What else could you do? We were beyond exhausted, beyond hungry, beyond cold. We'd reached a state where you just exist, functioning on pure instinct and muscle memory, too tired to think, too numb to feel. You breathe. You watch your sector. You pull the trigger when you see a target. That's all there is. Colonel Roberts, our regimental commander, came around to the forward positions that evening. He looked as bad as we did, maybe worse. Hollow-eyed, unshaven, uniform caked with mud and blood. But he stood tall and he spoke clearly. Told us that Patton's Third Army was driving north from Luxembourg, fighting their way through German lines to reach us. They'd be here soon. Days, not weeks. We just had to hold on a little longer. Just keep the Germans out of Bastogne for a few more days and we'd be relieved. He made it sound simple. Just survive. Just don't die. Just keep fighting with no ammunition, no food, no hope. Simple. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But sitting in that frozen hole with Patterson, who'd stopped talking, and Kowalski, who'd stopped joking, watching the snow fall and listening to distant artillery, I couldn't make myself believe that relief was actually coming. It felt like we'd been abandoned in this frozen hell to die, and all the promises of rescue were just lies to keep us fighting a little longer. Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944. The weather cleared for a few hours in the morning. The snow stopped falling, the clouds broke apart, and for the first time in days we saw blue sky. And then we saw the airplanes, C-47 transport aircraft, dozens of them, flying low over Bastogne at maybe 500 feet altitude. Air resupply. They'd finally made it through. The planes came in steady streams, dropping parachutes loaded with supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, food, everything we desperately needed. The Germans opened up with every anti-aircraft gun they had, 20mm and 37mm flak guns firing from positions all around Bastogne. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells, tracer rounds arced up toward the C-47s like deadly fireworks. We watched 2 planes get hit. One caught fire and went down trailing smoke, crashed maybe a mile away, killed everyone aboard. The second took multiple hits to its fuselage, limped away trailing fuel, maybe made it back to base, or maybe went down somewhere over German-held territory. But the rest kept coming, kept dropping their supplies, kept flying straight and level through the flak because they knew we were counting on them. Most of the parachutes landed in our sector or in Bastogne itself. Some landed in no man's land. A few landed in German-controlled territory. But enough got through. We scrambled out of our positions to retrieve the supply bundles, dragging them back to our lines under sporadic German rifle fire. I personally recovered 2 bundles. One contained ammunition, bandoliers for M1s, boxes of .30 caliber for the machine guns, rockets for the bazookas. I took a fresh bandolier, 8 clips, 64 rounds total. It felt like Christmas for real, like waking up as a kid and finding presents under the tree. The second bundle contained medical supplies, morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, bandages, plasma. The medics nearly cried when they saw it. And food, real food, canned meat, canned vegetables, bread, chocolate, cigarettes. I ate an entire can of ham by myself, didn't even heat it, just opened the can with my bayonet and ate it cold with my fingers. It was the best meal I'd ever had. My stomach, shrunken from days of near starvation, nearly rejected it. I had to force myself to eat slowly to keep it down. Patterson ate a whole chocolate bar in about 30 seconds, threw up, ate another one. The resupply transformed the entire division's morale. We had ammunition again. We had food. We had hope. We could hold out. But the resupply wasn't enough, not nearly enough. They estimated we'd need maybe 200 tons of supplies to sustain the division for another week. The C-47s dropped maybe 100 tons, and half of that landed in areas we couldn't recover. So we were still rationing, still making do with less than we needed, still slowly starving and freezing. But it was better than nothing. It bought us a few more days. That afternoon, December 25th, a German delegation came forward under a white flag. 2 officers and an enlisted man carrying a written message. They wanted to speak with our commanding officer. General Anthony McAuliffe was the acting division commander since General Maxwell Taylor was back in the States on leave. The Germans delivered their ultimatum in writing, basically said we were completely surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, with no hope of relief. Honorable surrender now would save American lives and allow wounded to receive proper medical treatment. Resistance was futile. The German commander was prepared to accept our surrender under the full protection of the Geneva Convention. They gave us 2 hours to respond. General McAuliffe read the ultimatum, thought about it for maybe 10 seconds, and wrote a one-word reply on a piece of paper. Nuts. That's it, just nuts. He sent it back with the German envoy. The German officers apparently didn't understand what nuts meant, thought maybe it was a code word. McAuliffe's staff had to explain that it was American slang for go to hell, or absolutely not, or fuck off. The Germans were reportedly offended by the informality, but they got the message. No surrender, no negotiation. Come and take it if you can. When word spread through the defensive lines about McAuliffe's response, guys started laughing. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was the absurdity of it. Maybe it was relief that someone in command had as much contempt for the German ultimatum as we did. Maybe it was just hysteria from exhaustion and stress. But we laughed. Sitting in frozen foxholes with maybe a day's worth of ammunition and half rations of food, completely surrounded by the German army, we laughed at the one-word rejection of their surrender demand. It was so perfectly American, so casual, so dismissive. Nuts. Just nuts. Go to hell. We're staying. The Germans responded with the heaviest artillery barrage we'd experienced yet. Started maybe an hour after receiving McAuliffe's response. Shells rained down on Bastogne and all the defensive positions around the town perimeter for hours. 88, 105 meter, 150, every caliber the Germans had. The shelling was systematic, walking back and forth across our positions, methodical and thorough. You'd hear the whistle of incoming rounds. That distinctive rising whine that makes your balls try to crawl up into your chest, and then the explosion. Dirt and snow and shrapnel flying everywhere. Trees snapping like matchsticks. The ground shaking so hard it felt like an earthquake. We pressed ourselves into the bottom of our foxholes, curled into the smallest possible shape, helmets pulled down, praying that the next shell wouldn't land directly on top of us. The artillery was terrifying in a way that rifle fire never was. You couldn't fight back against it. You couldn't shoot back at shells falling from the sky. You just had to endure it, helpless, waiting for random chance to decide whether you lived or died. A shell landed maybe 30 yards from my position. The concussion wave hit like being punched in the chest by a giant invisible fist. My helmet flew off my head. My ears rang so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Blood trickled from my nose. When the barrage finally stopped, maybe 2 hours later, we counted casualties. 4 men dead in our platoon, 7 wounded. One of the dead was Patterson. He'd taken shrapnel from a near miss. Multiple pieces that had punched through his helmet and into his skull killed him instantly. I hope it was instant. I hope he didn't suffer. His body was still in our foxhole, slumped against one wall, blood frozen in a dark pool beneath him. I pulled his dog tags off his neck, took his rifle and ammunition, and moved to another position because mine had partially collapsed from the shelling. I didn't have time to feel anything about Patterson's death. No time to grieve or process what had happened. That comes later if you survive. In the moment, you just keep functioning. Someone died, you take their gear, you keep fighting. That's war. The night of December 25th, going into December 26th, the Germans launched their biggest coordinated attack yet. They hit our sector and 2 others simultaneously, trying to overwhelm our defenses through multiple breakthroughs. They came at us with everything. Tanks in the lead, at least a dozen panzers and assault guns grinding forward through the snow. Behind them, waves of infantry, maybe 300 or 400 men, all yelling and screaming, trying to terrify us into breaking. They fired white phosphorus shells into the tree line, trying to burn us out of our positions. They fired flares to illuminate the battlefield, turning night into day. It was like something out of a nightmare. The panzers came first, their machine guns blazing. Main guns firing high explosive shells into our positions. We opened up with everything we had left. The Browning machine guns hammered away, that heavy chugging sound, tracers reaching out toward the German armor. M1 rifles cracked continuously. Someone got a bazooka shot off and knocked out the lead tank, brewed it up, the explosion lighting the entire forest. German infantry went to ground, returning fire from behind trees and fallen logs. The battlefield became pure chaos. No tactics, no maneuver, just two forces hammering at each other from 50 yards apart. I fired my M1 until the barrel was too hot to touch, the wood handguard smoking, reloaded, fired again, fired at muzzle flashes in the darkness, at silhouettes moving between trees, at any target I could identify. A German soldier appeared directly in front of my position, maybe 15 yards away, coming at me with a rifle and fixed bayonet. I shot him 3 times center mass and he went down hard, the bayonet stabbing into frozen ground as he fell. Another German came from the left flank. Shot him too. They kept coming. For maybe 45 minutes, it was sustained close-quarters combat. No room for fear, no time to think, just react and reload and shoot again. Men screaming in English and German. Explosions. Gunfire. Smoke and fire and the smell of cordite and blood and burned flesh. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The Germans pulled back. The tanks reversed into the darkness, covered by their infantry who fell back in good order, firing as they withdrew. We held the line. Barely. When I checked my ammunition after the attack ended, I had exactly 5 rounds left in my rifle. 5. That's it. Guys all around me were in similar situations. Maybe 10 rounds left. Maybe none. If the Germans had known how close they were to breaking through, if they'd pressed the attack for another 10 minutes, they would have overrun our positions entirely. We'd have been wiped out, but they didn't know. They thought we were dug in deep with full ammunition supplies and fresh reinforcements. They thought we were stronger than we actually were. That misconception saved our lives. The Germans pulled back thinking they'd hit a strong defensive position that would require a major effort to crack, when in reality they'd been 10 minutes away from total victory. That's warfare. Perception matters as much as reality. If your enemy thinks you're strong, you are strong even when you're on your last magazine. Dawn, December 26, 1944. We heard something different, not German engines, not artillery, American tanks, coming from the south. At first I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion and blood loss, because I'd been hit by shrapnel during the night attack. Nothing serious, but enough that I was bleeding from my left shoulder. But then Kowalski grabbed my good shoulder and shook me, pointed south through the trees. Maybe 2 miles away, visible in the pre-dawn light, we could see them. Sherman tanks, a whole column of them, advancing north up the main road toward Bastogne. They were painted white for winter camouflage, moving fast, their guns traversing side to side as they advanced. Patton's Third Army, the 4th Armored Division. They'd broken through the German encirclement. They'd reached us. The siege was over. Guys started standing up in their foxholes despite the danger of German snipers still in the woods. Some started cheering, waving their helmets. Others just cried. I sat down in my foxhole and stared at nothing. I couldn't process what was happening. For 7 days we'd been alone, surrounded, slowly dying from cold and hunger and German attacks. We'd been told relief was coming, but I hadn't really believed it. I thought we were going to die in these woods, forgotten by the army, abandoned to our fate. And now suddenly it was over. We were saved. The tanks rolled into Bastogne that morning, bringing with them fresh infantry, fresh supplies, fresh hope. They brought winter coats and insulated boots. They brought ammunition by the truckload. They brought hot food, real food, not K-rations, but actual meals cooked in field kitchens. They brought medics and doctors to treat our wounded. They brought the promise that we wouldn't die here after all. The relief convoy changed everything tactically, but the battle wasn't over. The Germans kept attacking through January, trying to retake Bastogne, trying to salvage something from their failed offensive. We held them every time. With fresh supplies and reinforcements, we were no longer just surviving. We were fighting back, counterattacking, pushing the Germans back toward their original lines. By mid-January, the entire German offensive had stalled completely. They'd thrown everything they had at us, their last strategic reserves, their best SS divisions and panzer units, and they'd failed to break through. The Battle of the Bulge, that's what history calls it now because of the shape the German advance made on Allied maps. A bulge pushing west into Belgium. But we stopped them. Not just at Bastogne, but all along the front from Monschau to Echternach. American units held the line, absorbed the initial shock, counterattacked, and broke the back of the German army's last offensive capability. By February 1945, the Germans were in full retreat, and they never launched another major offensive, for the remainder of the war in Europe. I stayed with the 101st Airborne through the end of the war. We pushed into Germany in the spring, crossed the Rhine River, liberated concentration camps, where we saw horrors that made combat look clean by comparison. We accepted German surrenders by the thousands, whole units just giving up because they knew the war was lost. We occupied Bavaria, and on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. We'd won. I came home in early 1946, got discharged at Fort Dix, New Jersey, with my service medals and an honorable discharge certificate and about $300 in back pay. Took a bus back to Michigan, walked into my parents' house and tried to pretend the previous 3 years hadn't happened. Tried to go back to being the person I'd been before I jumped into Normandy, before Bastogne, before all of it. It didn't work. You can't unsee what I saw, you can't unfeel what I felt. You can't go back to normal after you've lived in a frozen hole for a week waiting to die. The nightmares started maybe a month after I got home. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning hearing German voices in the woods outside my window. Artillery shells whistling overhead. The scream of incoming fire. I'd smell cordite and blood and burned flesh. Smells that weren't really there. I'd see Patterson's face, frozen in death, superimposed over the faces of my wife, my kids, strangers on the street. The Veterans Administration called it battle fatigue, or combat exhaustion. Later they'd give it a fancier name, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. I just called it the price you pay for surviving when better men didn't. I never talked about Bastogne. Not to my wife, not to my children, not to other veterans. What was there to say? That I spent a week freezing and starving in a hole in Belgium while Germans tried to kill me. That I watched friends die and killed men whose names I never knew. That the proudest moment of my military service, holding Bastogne against impossible odds, was also the absolute worst week of my entire life. Who wants to hear that? Who would understand? But people do want to know. Historians started interviewing Bastogne veterans in the 50s and 60s, journalists writing books and articles, filmmakers making documentaries, kids doing school projects about World War II. They all want to understand what happened at Bastogne, why it mattered, what it felt like to be there. And I've always struggled to explain it adequately. How do you convey what it's like to be 23 years old, surrounded by the German army, out of food and ammunition, certain you're going to die, and yet somehow finding the will to keep fighting? How do you explain the terror of artillery barrages, or the exhaustion of days without sleep, or the grinding cold that never goes away? How do you make someone who wasn't there understand the smell of death in winter, the way frozen corpses don't decay, but just lie there forever like monuments to futility? You can't. Words fail. But I'll try anyway because I think it matters that people know what we did, what we endured, what we paid. Bastogne mattered because it was the moment the German war machine finally broke against American resolve. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, his last attempt to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace so Germany could concentrate all its forces against the Soviet Union. It was a desperate plan conceived in desperation, and it almost worked. The initial German assault achieved total surprise. They punched through weak American positions in the Ardennes, advanced 40 miles in the first few days, captured thousands of prisoners, spread panic through Allied command. If they'd broken through at Bastogne, if they'd taken that critical road junction and kept advancing west toward the Meuse River, they might have achieved their objectives. The Allied front might have collapsed. The war might have dragged on for months or years longer. But they didn't break through at Bastogne. We held. One understrength Airborne Division and supporting units, surrounded and outnumbered, held against everything Germany could throw at us. And in holding Bastogne, we stopped the entire German offensive dead in its tracks. They couldn't bypass us because we controlled all the roads they needed. They couldn't take us by assault because we fought too hard. So they sat outside Bastogne and wasted time and resources and men trying to crack our defenses while Patton drove north to relieve us and the rest of the Allied line stabilized and counterattacked. By the time the Germans finally admitted their offensive had failed, they'd lost the last of their mobile reserves, their fuel supplies, their strategic initiative. After Bastogne, it was all retreat and surrender for Germany. The Wehrmacht was finished as an offensive force, The Red Army was closing in from the east. The Western Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine. Germany's defeat became inevitable the moment we held Bastogne. We didn't do it alone. Other units held other critical positions. The 82nd Airborne held the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions stopped German spearheads short of the Meuse. Regular infantry divisions absorbed the initial shock and fought desperate delaying actions. But Bastogne became the symbol of American resistance, the place where we proved we wouldn't break no matter what. And that matters psychologically as much as militarily. The Germans had spent 5 years conquering Europe, rolling over enemy armies through blitzkrieg tactics and combined arms warfare. They'd beaten Poland, France, the Low Countries, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece. They'd pushed deep into the Soviet Union, reached the outskirts of Moscow and Stalingrad. They thought they were unbeatable when they attacked through the Ardennes in December 1944. They thought we'd panic and retreat and collapse like every other army they'd faced. They thought wrong. We held. American soldiers, mostly teenagers and young men in their 20s, held against veteran German units and SS divisions and panzer formations. We held without winter gear, without adequate supplies, without air support for days. We held because we didn't know how to quit, because retreat wasn't in our vocabulary, because the guys in the next foxhole were depending on you, and you'd rather die than let them down. That's what the Germans learned at Bastogne. American soldiers don't break. You can surround us, starve us, shell us, attack us with tanks and infantry, and we'll still hold the line. That lesson, that demonstration of American fighting spirit, that's what broke the German army's will to continue the offensive. They realized they weren't fighting French conscripts or Polish cavalry anymore. They were fighting Americans, and we'd fight to the last bullet, the last grenade, the last man if necessary. People ask me if I'm proud of what we did at Bastogne. That's a complicated question. Proud implies satisfaction, accomplishment, something positive. What I feel about Bastogne is more complex than pride. I'm satisfied we did our jobs under impossible circumstances. I'm grateful we held long enough for relief to arrive instead of being wiped out. I'm haunted by the men who didn't make it, the Pattersons and dozens of others who died in frozen foxholes or aid stations, or on operating tables, who sacrificed everything so the rest of us could live. I'm angry sometimes that we were put in that situation at all, sent to hold a position with inadequate supplies and no winter gear against overwhelming enemy forces. I'm traumatized by memories that never fade, nightmares that still wake me up 70 years later, sounds and smells and images seared into my brain that I'll carry until I die. But proud? I guess so. We did something significant. We held Bastogne, and in doing so, we changed the course of the war. We proved something important about American soldiers and American determination. We showed the world that we wouldn't quit no matter how bad things got. That has to count for something. That has to mean something beyond the personal cost we paid. I'm 98 years old now as I record this testimony. Most of the men I served with at Bastogne are dead. Kowalski died in 1983 from a heart attack. Lieutenant Macready was killed in Korea in 1951. Of the 140 men who deployed to Bastogne with Easy Company, 502nd PIR, maybe a dozen are still alive, scattered across the country, all of us in our 90s, all of us carrying the weight of those 7 days in December 1944. We get together once a year if we can, at VFW halls or hotels near Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where the 101st is still based. We don't talk much about what happened. We don't need to. We remember. We remember the cold that penetrated everything, the hunger that gnawed at your guts, the exhaustion that turned your legs to rubber and your brain to mush. We remember friends who died there and were buried in temporary graves that later became permanent ones in military cemeteries in Belgium. We remember the sound of German tanks and American C-47s and artillery shells whistling overhead. We remember General McAuliffe's one-word response to the German surrender demand. We remember holding the line when the line had to be held, no matter the cost. The government gave us medals and commendations. The 101st Airborne received a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Bastogne. Individual soldiers got Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts. I got a Bronze Star for actions during the German attack on Christmas night, though I still don't know exactly what I did to earn it beyond surviving. President Truman visited the division after the war, called us the finest fighting force in American military history. We've been written about in books and portrayed in movies and documentaries. Bastogne has become legendary, the ultimate story of American soldiers holding against impossible odds. But you know what I remember most clearly? Not the medals or the recognition or the historical significance. I remember the chocolate bar I split with Patterson our first night in Bastogne. The way his hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. The way he threw up after killing his first German. The way he sat in our foxhole praying silently during the artillery barrages. The way he died on Christmas Day, killed by random shrapnel from a shell that landed nearby, his blood freezing in the snow. That's what Bastogne means to me personally. Not the big picture military significance, but the small human moments. One kid from Iowa who tried his best and died anyway. And the thousands of other kids just like him, who held the line because that's what we were ordered to do, and because quitting never occurred to us as an option. So when historians ask me about the Battle of the Bulge, about what it was like at Bastogne, about why we didn't surrender when the Germans offered us the chance, I tell them this. We held because we didn't know how to quit. We held because the alternative was worse. We held because the guys next to us were counting on us, and we couldn't let them down. We held because we were American soldiers, paratroopers, the 101st Airborne, and retreat wasn't in our training or our vocabulary or our character. The Germans thought we'd break. They thought a week of siege and starvation and constant attacks would shatter our will to resist. They were wrong. We got stronger the worse things got. We got meaner. We got more determined. By the time relief arrived on December 26th, we weren't the same men who'd arrived in Bastogne on December 19th. We'd been forged in fire and ice and blood. We'd become something harder, something that couldn't be broken by anything the Germans could do to us. And I think the Germans sensed that. I think that's why they pulled back after Christmas, why they didn't press harder, why they ultimately failed to break through. They realized they weren't just fighting a position or a town. They were fighting men who'd decided they'd rather die than surrender. And you can't defeat that kind of determination with tanks or artillery or superior numbers. You can kill men like that, but you can't make them quit. That's the lesson of Bastogne. That's what I want people to understand. War isn't about grand strategy or brilliant tactics or technological superiority, though all those things matter. War is about human beings in extreme situations, making impossible choices. Do you stand or do you run? Do you fight or do you surrender? Do you endure or do you break? At Bastogne we chose to stand, to fight, to endure. And that choice, multiplied by thousands of soldiers making it simultaneously, changed everything. The Germans lost the war at Bastogne. They didn't know it yet. They'd fight on for another 5 months, killing and dying until Berlin fell and Hitler killed himself in his bunker. But the outcome was decided in those Belgian woods in December 1944. We held the line. We didn't break. And because we didn't break, Germany couldn't win. It's that simple and that complicated. 1 week in hell that determined the fate of the war and the future of Europe. One group of cold, hungry, terrified young men who refused to quit no matter what. That's Bastogne. That's what we did. That's what we paid. And I'll carry those 7 days with me for whatever time I have left. Every frozen moment, every dead friend, every bullet fired in desperation, every prayer whispered in darkness. Bastogne never leaves you. It stays in your bones like the cold, in your dreams like the nightmares, in your soul like a wound that never quite heals. We held the line. We broke the German offensive, and we paid for it with pieces of ourselves that we left behind in those frozen woods, pieces we'll never get back.